Today we welcome to Global Citizenship Education interview series Dr. Karen Pashby. Karen is a reader of education studies in the School of Childhood, Youth and Education Studies at the Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. She teaches undergraduates and postgraduates and is a university-wide academic lead on undergraduate research internships. A core member of the Education and Social Research Institute, she co-leads the Education and Global Futures Research Group. Karen is Adjunct Professor at the University of Alberta, Department of Educational Policy Studies, and Docent at the University of Helsinki, Faculty of Educational Sciences. A former secondary educator in Canada and Brazil, an experienced teacher and educator and the university level educator in Canada, Finland, and the UK, her research draws on postcolonial and decolonial theoretical resources to examine and support productive pedagogical tensions in education for global citizenship, particularly in so-called multicultural contexts. Recent work has examined intersections with environmental and sustainability research and anti-oppressive pedagogies. So, Karen, it's a pleasure to have you here. Finally, we can speak. It was difficult.
Thank you for your patience in organizing it.
But it's a real pleasure. And I'm very happy that we are speaking today because several of your publications inform my recent publications and less recent publications, particularly because you're writing from a critical decolonial, postcolonial perspectives on a very important topic and debated topic and complex and dynamic, the topic of global citizenship, particularly global citizenship education. So again, I want to thank you for being here and discussing your perspectives.
Yes, well, it definitely keeps us busy, right?
Right. So there is a question that all my guests here would get at the beginning of this conversation. Is quite a straightforward and challenging question. And the question is, what is, in your opinion, global citizenship and global citizenship education? And what does it mean to educate global citizens in the era of globalization?
Yes, it's a big question. So I'll see what I can do. I mean, I think the short answer is that global citizenship and global citizenship education raise a set of tensions, which personally I find to be productive, in the sense that they're the kinds of tensions we need to be grappling with and working through. But others, have a different perspective. And if I start with global citizenship, from my understanding, it's a concept or term that started to gain quite a lot of traction at the turn to the 21st century. And so looking back at what had happened through the 20th century, which was, to be really short and blunt, was a century of nation state creation and organization. And looking towards the 21st century and these very complex and challenging problems we were facing, kind of considering what it would be like to, and how we might imagine organizing ourselves, sure, within nation states, but also beyond, or extending those rights and responsibilities beyond the nation state structures, because nation state structures can enable certain things, but are also limiting in some ways. And so that has then created a set of problems within global citizenship, research, which there's tons of, and people like Nigel Dower, and looking at it from an education side as well, have kind of raised, look, this is really almost impossible, global citizenship. So you kind of get stuck, you can get stuck at global citizenship. Thankfully, I'm an educator and educational researcher. So when you add education into the mix, so global citizenship education, now the aspirational quality takes some shape, in my opinion, or in my view. So, education can be a generative space to explore impossibilities and possibilities. And for me, that's the exciting bit about studying about global citizenship education, because it kind of allows us to raise the questions of what we've inherited from the 21st, 20th, and well before that centuries around how we understand ourselves in the world. And we can appreciate some things. We can also resist and reject some things, and we can hopefully both learn and unlearn. And I think that's true in non-formal, informal, and formal spaces, though my work has been largely in the latter. So to me, then, global citizenship education could be about creating spaces, to unpack the ways of relating that we've inherited and think about what we want to do moving forward. But it's the fact that it's impossible and contested that I think also makes it like such an important and interesting concept. I mean, from my own experience, I came across it in practice first when I was working at a school in Brazil, and we were creating a mission statement. Remember, that was all the rage in the early 2000s, right, to create mission statements. And so the school I was working at, Brazil, wanted to include global citizens in the mission statement. And it created a lot of tension and conversation. And to me, it was like one of the most interesting sets of conversations I had while I was in Brazil around what are we doing here? How is our school and what we're about connected to the wider world, but also the local issues right there in Brazil? So when I went on to graduate school, I kind of kept looking at what is this concept? How does it work? And in the context of Canada, where I then went to do my grad school, it was a really useful way for me personally to start to unpack the sets of assumptions I had around multicultural education in particular, which is a very strong discourse in Canada, and also in the context, of truth and reconciliation in Canada, and my own and my ancestors' experience as settlers. And so, I think it's this impossible possibility that raises important discussions, particularly in terms of education, and opens up like critical possibilities for me anyway.
Very interesting. And I want to, in relation to what you just said, particularly when you were, I was very interested when you say that the section, the area that makes you very excited about discussing the notion of global citizenship and global citizenship education is that it opens up a conversation that is a conversation on multiple levels, multiple perspectives. And recently I'm writing a paper, and so I came across one of your writings, and I want to take this opportunity to briefly mention that to you and see what we can develop on this. And then is a publication that you did, I believe, in 2016 with Vanessa Andreotti, where you're saying that while some critical orientations, referring to critical orientations of GC, of global citizenship education, might selectively target oppressive patterns, such as a capitalist exploitation and processes of racialization, the main intersection with liberal and neoliberal discourses reproduce modern desires, including the desire to help and be transformational, are themselves implicated in the modern colonial grammar. And then there is a little bit more of explanation, but I just want to discuss this with you to build up on what you said in the first part of this interview.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you might be aware of our typologies of typologies paper, as we call it, because global citizenship, I mean, this is what's so interesting to study, because I think like Doug Bourne and Lynette Schultz and others have talked about it as an umbrella term. I think it's also a shapeshifter, and I think it's also a touchstone, so it's reflexive and reflective of the current, I guess you could say, ideological context in which we live, which is complex. And it's not as if it's very easy to pinpoint one way, right? This is it. This is the way to do global citizenship education. Rather, those of us who've been taking a more critical approach see it as a space to then reflect on and critique different approaches, which includes our own approach, right? And so what we were doing when we were kind of trying to map these things is we took a heuristic that we have been using in the ethical internationalization in higher education project, which is this triangle one. You might be familiar with it. And I won't bore everybody with the details, but basically we had identified 3 key discursive orientations that we thought were kind of being mobilized in global citizenship education. So we had the neoliberal, the liberal humanist, and the critical. And when we were talking about it as a group of researchers, we were like, yeah, we can see how like those 3 describe kind of what we think are 3 of the main kind of discursive orientations, but hardly anything neatly fits into each of those 3. And I think what the heuristic contributed was when we added the interfaces. Right. And so the interfaces are like spaces of ambivalence where you can see kind of 2 discursive orientations working kind of at once. And I think that was a moment for me because I thought, it's true, like you can kind of be taking up some of the things that you've inherited. Most of us have been socialized into kind of a liberal humanist view of wanting to help others and transform the world and learn ourselves. And these aren't, it's not like, ooh, that's terrible and that's bad. But we haven't often recognized the way that those well-intended approaches can actually reproduce the systems of oppression, and particularly those that we've inherited through the modern colonial imaginary that education and all of our institutions of modernity sit within. Oh, I don't know if that helps a little bit, but I guess what we're trying to say in that point is, those of us that are looking at the critical, we're not outside of the others. And just because we take a critical approach doesn't mean that we don't also exist and work within kind of modern institutions, and that we might not kind of slip into the liberal humanist perspective sometimes and need to kind of be aware of that.
Now, that's very interesting. The whole interface discussion is very, very interesting. And I'd like to, and I believe this is related to what we are discussing right now, to ask you about your journey as an educator, journey of life, and how this connects with your commitment to publish and research on global citizenship and global citizenship education.
Well, I mean, it's quite obvious that I'm a white, English native, quote unquote, native English speaking, as I said, settler from a settler family with, 7 generations in Canada. So I have in the grand scheme of, if we're considering global citizenship, I occupy and benefit from a lot of social privilege and economic and educative privilege. And so for me, I also represent a large part of the demographic of the teaching profession, certainly in North America and Europe. So my kind of journey to start unpacking and questioning notions of privilege and complicity within global citizenship for me has been very productive in my work with teacher education and other places, because I hope this changes. It ought to change, but currently we do have this sort of demographic trend in the teaching profession. So it's really important that we can situate ourselves in these complexities and start to think differently and reflect differently and understand what we bring to the conversation, and also how what we bring to the conversation is limited and complicit. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's
I think it's a very important point. If I understood correctly, you're saying the recognitions, the awareness, the consciousness of your being in this list of privileged educators, white and like myself and many others, pushed you to reckon, to kind of engage with this privilege, and you're saying that probably the whole discussion around critical global citizenship education connects to your recognition that there is all an important discussion that we should advance about what does it mean to have the privilege to develop education, teach education. Did I understand correctly?
Yeah, and I think it's a reflection of the wider issues we have in both academia and education and in the teaching profession. And it's also a really big tension in my work because, I mean, I have a job based on my publications in global citizenship education as well. So the tensions in this work kind of don't end, right? And that kind of always something we have to be working with.
Right. Okay, sounds good. So let's move on with our next question. I'd like you to discuss, and this is very interesting, your recent work on teaching for sustainable development through ethical global issues pedagogy, particularly a publication that I was reading a while ago while I was preparing for our conversation, Teaching for Sustainable Development Through Ethical Global Issues Pedagogy, a resource for secondary teachers. So this is a core point in our discussion, because I do believe that there is a lot of theory, but there is a less practice and less principles connected to how to implement global citizenship and sustainable development education and all this area of trying to implement values, sustainable values within education is largely theorized, frequently from a Western perspective, but that's another issue. But there is less on how to implement this, and I believe, if I remember correctly, that your research is aiming at providing practical suggestions and based on the research that you conducted on how to implement global issues in an ethical perspective, and there is a proposal for a framework to do so.
Yeah, so that particular project, it was in 2018 to 2019, and we responded, therefore, to a call in 2017, which was, if you imagine, like SDGs got ratified in 2015. So someone like me, who had been doing critical work in global citizenship, was both really excited and also petrified of the fact that global citizenship education featured so predominantly in SDG 4.7. I mean, happy because, as I explained before, there's lots of reasons to think this is a good space for raising interesting discussions and pedagogies, but also kind of scared that we would just that it would just be a remobilization of the same things we've kind of always done in global learning. And there's an established critique that a lot of the times our approaches to global learning reproduce an us and a them and reproduce colonial systems of power. Now, at the same time, my colleague Louise Sund in Sweden was making similar critiques and engaged in similar work in environmental and sustainability education. And both of us have been using Vanessa Andreotti's, and specifically her Heads Up tool, which identifies 7 patterns of oppression that tend to be reproduced in global learning, particularly in global, quote unquote, global North context, studying issues in global South context. And so I saw the funding come out from the British Academy, and I thought, well, hey, we've got the SDGs coming out, we've got this critique. You're right, Emiliano, that it has tended to be very grounded theoretically, but not necessarily in practice. So we thought about bringing the Heads Up tool to teachers of secondary and upper secondary school in England, Finland, and Sweden, and teaching them about it or introducing them to it, then just getting their feedback about it. We offered, if they wanted to apply it in whatever way they wanted in their classrooms, that we would come and observe and then ask them some questions afterwards. And there was enough going on with teachers excited about this that then we proposed, and it worked out, that we co-created this resource. that take something like Heads Up, because I was always being told it's too theoretical, the students won't understand, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And you can see in the resource, like, actually, there are ways to adapt it to practice. So that's sort of what was going on in that project.
All right. And the ethical aspect of it is also interesting. The ethical element, what does it mean exactly? Because I believe this is important, particularly because I'm very interested in values, but I like to hear your perspective on this. What does it mean ethical in this project, for example, or in your view, as it relates to our discussion on global citizenship and global citizenship education?
Well, there is a relationship between ethics and values that would be probably the topic for another conversation. But I think the reason we focused on ethics is, I mean, I was reviewing some of your interviews before today, and I know in the first question, Lynette Schultz answered that global citizenship education is an ethical platform, right, where learners can stop to deeply consider how they view themselves in the world and what's going on around them and how they're related to them. And if I combine what she said there with this discussion we've been having about how global citizenship education discussions are, of course, embedded in the colonial modern imaginary, then what we mean by ethical global issues is taking these things up. So actually raising the fact that we have a tendency to reproduce these colonial systems of power as a pedagogical imperative. And we know this is happening. Like, we know that, for example, with climate change, there's a big ethical issue around who is the most responsible for climate change and who is the most negatively impacted by climate change. And so those are really giant questions, but what we were trying to do with this project is to see whether using the Heads Up tool help to raise these ethical questions and more directly and explicitly, and potentially see some productive pedagogical work out of it.
Right. I will include the link to this project once this video interview is published, so everyone can see it. I believe it's publicly available.
Yeah.
So
and it's translated into Finnish, Swedish, and recently Portuguese as well.
Wonderful. So it's even multilingual. So that's wonderful. Okay. So now we are heading towards the end of this very interesting conversation with Karen Pashby, and there is a final question, a challenging one, and the question is: how would you define global citizenship education using 3 keywords, and why these 3 keywords?
Yeah, that's a hard one for sure. It's like choosing between your children. You know, we're our job is to come up with words, right? But I think if I have to choose 3 words to define global citizenship, it would be reflexive, contested, and productive. So
and productive.
Yeah.
Okay.
The last one's a bit iffy because it sounds kind of instrumentalist, but what I mean by it is, I think it's, maybe I should put contested first. I mean, it's contested. That is the challenge and beauty of the concept. And the second that we nail it down and decide what it is, fundamentally is the time when I'll stop being interested in it. It's the fact that it is a space of contestation. It's an impossibility that we aspire to and work with. It raises, I have found, discussions around global citizenship education and what it can and can't be, raises some of the most important ethical discussions of our time. I don't think I'm overstating it, and I've seen this reflected in work with young people and people of all ages, actually. So the reflexive piece is really important, because if those contested conversations are going to lead to productive ways of relating differently from how we've inherited, then we have to be reflexive. We all have to understand that we're both, as Vanessa would say, are part of the problem and part of the solution, albeit differently. And then the productive part is, perhaps not the best term, but what I mean about it is, I like to say productive tensions. And what I mean by that is, we have to be grappling with these things. I'd like to save the educational spaces for these kinds of discussions and the deep conceptual work that can happen, because although we have made a real move in the right direction, you could say, to kind of get away from memorizing things about, and seeing learning as just knowledge-based memorization. And there's been a move towards trying to have more active citizenship, which I think is a positive trend. I think there's a really important space for the conceptual work, and I've seen it with young people and with teachers. So in that space, I think these contestations and tensions can be productive.
Absolutely. So contested, reflexive, and productive. These are the three key words. Okay. Well, of course, it was.
Ask me tomorrow, and I might come up with 3 different ones.
It was hard choosing, but I'm sure we can develop further discussion. All right, thank you so much to Karen Pashby. It was a pleasure, Karen, to have you here. It was a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you.